I had just finished setting up the last table when the first of her friends walked past me and said, "Oh, the help is here early." Not to me. About me. Loud enough for the three women beside her to snicker into their champagne flutes. I was holding a centerpiece I'd spent 2 hours arranging. My hands were shaking, but I didn't drop it. I stood there in the middle of my own family's backyard, surrounded by 40 people I'd never met, wearing a dress my mother had worn to her own engagement party 40 years ago, and I felt like a trespasser in my own life. My name is Corinne Ellis. Everyone calls me Corey. I'm 42 years old and I run Ellis Antiques and Estate Sales out of a converted carriage house in Philadelphia's Germantown neighborhood. My grandfather started the business in 1968, buying abandoned storage lockers and forgotten attics, finding the beauty in things other people threw away. He taught me that value isn't about what something looks like on the surface, it's about what it's survived. That lesson stuck with me longer than any other. I just didn't realize I'd need to apply it to my own family. The engagement party was for my daughter Elena. She's 25, a graduate student in art history at Bryn Mawr, and she'd been dating Declan Ashford for about 16 months. Declan came from what people politely call old mainline money. His father, Arthur Ashford, ran a real estate development firm that had been swallowing up historic properties across the Delaware Valley for 3 decades. His mother, Margaret, served on the board of the Philadelphia Museum of Art and had never once in her life said something that wasn't carefully calibrated to make someone else feel smaller. I should have seen it coming. I should have noticed the way Margaret looked at my hands when I served coffee at their Bryn Mawr estate. The way Arthur asked about my business like he was humoring a child's lemonade stand. The way Declan's sister Penelope laughed when I mentioned I'd driven to the engagement party in my 20-year-old station wagon. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was just a protective mother who didn't want to see her daughter marry into a family that made her feel less than. I told myself that for 18 months straight. The party was at Ashford House, this ridiculous Georgian revival mansion on 6 acres of perfectly manicured lawn. Margaret had insisted on hosting. "We want to do everything properly, Corinne," she'd said, patting my arm like I was a nervous child. "Let us take care of the details." I'd offered to handle the flowers. It was the only thing they'd let me contribute. I'd spent 3 days sourcing arrangements from local growers, driving to Lancaster County myself to pick up hydrangeas and garden roses. I'd arranged them on my dining room table until my fingers ached, then loaded them into my station wagon at 6 in the morning. When I arrived at Ashford House, Margaret took one look at my floral arrangements and said, "Oh, how rustic. The caterers can use them as accents on the service tables." She gestured toward the main tables, already covered in imported peonies from a florist I'd never heard of, flown in from somewhere I couldn't pronounce. I watched my work get relegated to the back of the catering tent. I didn't say anything. I never said anything. That was the problem. The evening was a blur of small talk and champagne. I circulated through the crowd of Ashford associates and their wives, wearing a smile that felt like a mask. I introduced myself as the mother of the bride-to-be. I watched eyes flick down to my dress, my mother's vintage 1980s silk, beautiful but clearly not new, then back up with that practiced blankness that wealthy Philadelphia society does so well. I heard more than one whisper. "Is that Elena's mother? Did she come alone? I thought Declan's fiancé had family money." I didn't correct them. I never did. 2 hours in, I found Elena in the powder room, touching up her lipstick. She looked beautiful in a cream-colored gown that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But her eyes had that tightness around them that I recognized from when she was a teenager, trying not to cry in front of me. "Are you okay?" I asked. "They just keep asking about Daddy," she said. Declan's grandmother wanted to know if he was coming into money. I told her he'd been dead for 15 years and she said, "Yes dear, but did he leave anything?" My ex-husband Marcus passed away when Elena was 10. He was a high school English teacher who lived on his salary and his love for poetry and never once cared about money. He left us a life insurance policy that paid off the mortgage and nothing else. He was the best man I ever knew, and the Ashfords had been asking about his estate like they were checking a box on a form. I put my hand on Elena's shoulder. "They're not worth it," I said. "You and Declan love each other. That's what matters." "I know," she said. But she didn't look like she believed it. She looked like a woman trying to convince herself that everything was fine while standing in the middle of a room full of people who were already counting her out. I went back out to the main tent and found a quiet corner near the service entrance. I was tired. I was tired of smiling. I was tired of being measured against a standard I'd never even agreed to compete in. My grandfather always said, "The people who look down on you are usually the ones who can't see above their own noses." Lorraine would have loved that saying. She was a woman who saw people for exactly who they were. I miss her every day. Just before the speeches started, Declan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his face went pale. I saw him scan the crowd until he found me, and the look in his eyes was something I'd never seen before. He crossed the tent with his jaw tight and pulled me aside. "Corinne," he said, his voice low. "I need to show you something. And I need you to let me get through all of it before you react." I followed him to his car in the detached garage. He closed us inside and pulled up a series of emails on his phone. Correspondence between Arthur Ashford and a commercial developer from New Jersey. Subject lines about the Germantown corridor. Purchase agreements. Land valuations. Projected profit margins. "Your grandfather's property," Declan said. "The carriage house where you run your business. The block it sits on. My father has been acquiring parcels in that corridor for the past 2 years. He's been paying below market value through shell companies. There's a zoning variance coming through next spring that's going to triple the value of that entire stretch. He's been waiting. And he's been pressuring me to get Elena to convince you to sell." I couldn't process it at first. "Your father has been buying up Germantown?" "Not just Germantown," Declan said. "There's more." He opened a second file. Audio recordings. Dozens of them. He'd been documenting his father's conversations for months, ever since Arthur had let slip something about convincing the widow to cooperate. I listened to the first one. Arthur Ashford's voice, smooth and businesslike. "The Ellis property is the last piece. Once we own that corner, the whole development goes through. The granddaughter has leverage. She wants to be part of this family. She'll do what she's told." Margaret Ashford's voice in the background. "And the mother? She seems like the sentimental type. Hanging on to that old building because of some family nonsense. Sentiment is just inertia with a sentimental name. Once the zoning passes, the offers will be too good to refuse. She'll sign. They all sign." I sat in Declan's car and stared at the dashboard. Everything I'd been pretending not to see was suddenly undeniably real. The engagement wasn't about Elena. It was about the property. The Ashfords had calculated, with patience and precision, that my family's carriage house on Germantown Avenue was the missing piece in their development puzzle. And they had engineered their son's engagement to my daughter as the mechanism for acquiring it. My father had built that business from nothing. He'd worked 7 days a week. He'd refurbished furniture by hand. He'd taught me the difference between a genuine Chippendale and a reproduction from the 1930s. He'd taught me to measure value by history, not by price. And the Ashfords were going to bulldoze it to build luxury condominiums for people who'd never once set foot in Germantown. Declan was watching me with that pale, frightened look. "Corinne, I'm sorry. I didn't know until a few weeks ago. I was going to wait until after the engagement party to tell you. I didn't want to ruin it." I thought about Margaret Ashford's smile at the engagement dinner. Arthur's hand on Declan's shoulder. The way they looked at Elena like she was a transaction they'd already closed. I thought about my father and my grandfather and the 3 generations of early mornings and broken furniture and sweat baked into that carriage house. I thought about what my mother always told me when I was about to swallow something that shouldn't be swallowed. Truth doesn't need permission, Corey. It just needs a voice. I'm not signing anything, I said. And neither is Elena. Declan nodded. I know. That's why I'm showing you this. My father thinks I'm going to help him. He thinks I'm on his side. He's been applying pressure to Elena too, through my mother. Comments about money, about security, about how she's not used to the lifestyle yet. He wants her to push you to sell so he doesn't have to do it himself. I'd known about the comments. Elena had told me about them in pieces, trying not to hurt me. Trying to protect me from the fact that her future in-laws didn't think she was good enough. That they thought our family was the problem. That they were going to fix us by erasing everything we'd built. Declan, I said. What are you going to do? He told me. And honestly, part of me resisted. Part of me is a woman who was raised to solve things quietly, without spectacle. My grandfather's voice is still in my head. Don't perform your pain, Corey. Don't make a scene. Handle your business like a professional and move on. Part of me wanted to say, let's just walk away quietly. We'll call off the engagement, we'll keep the carriage house, we'll disappear from their lives. Then I thought about Margaret Ashford's voice on that recording. She's sentimental. She'll sign. I thought about Arthur's businesslike dismissal of everything my family had built. I thought about my mother, who had never let anyone tell her she was less than. I thought about the women in my family, the ones who had come before me, who had survived widowhood and poverty and being counted out. And I thought about what my mother always said when I was about to swallow something that shouldn't be swallowed. Don't let someone else tell you who you are, Corey. You know who you are. I said, I'm with you all the way. The next morning, I met Declan at his apartment in Center City. He'd brought a flash drive with all the audio files and property documents. We spent 3 hours organizing them, building a clear sequence of evidence. He had an old laptop we could use for the projection. We decided to present it at the wedding rehearsal dinner. It was the only time the entire Ashford circle would be together in one room, 2 nights before the ceremony. We told the venue it was a surprise tribute from Declan to his parents. We paid an extra fee to the AV technician to accommodate a last-minute presentation. The timing was planned to the minute. I went back to my carriage house that night and sat among the antiques. Victorian couches I'd reupholstered myself. Dining tables from the 1800s that I'd sanded and stained by hand. China cabinets full of dishes that had survived 3 generations of Ellis women. I thought about my father's hands, calloused and careful. I thought about my mother's voice, soft and steady. And something settled in my chest. Not rage, not even anticipation. Just clarity. The rehearsal dinner was at the Union League of Philadelphia. Margaret had spared no expense. Crystal chandeliers. Silver service. A 6-piece string ensemble playing something that sounded both expensive and vaguely ancestral. The Ashford contingent arrived first, Arthur with his chest forward and a smile like a shark, Margaret in a black velvet gown that probably cost more than my annual income. Their circle flowed in behind them, the whole theater of respectability. Declan stood at the front of the room in his navy suit, and to every other person there, he looked like a nervous groom rehearsing his vows. I knew my future son-in-law. I could read him across a room. His jaw was set. His hands were still. He was ready. I was seated at the second table, near the windows. Elena had chosen to sit near the back with her friends, on purpose. She knew what was coming. She'd been part of the planning from the beginning. We'd discussed it twice over the phone, keeping our voices calm and steady. She was braver than me. She's always been braver than me. Margaret caught my eye from the main table. She smiled that practiced smile and raised her glass slightly in a gesture of acknowledgement. I held her eyes and did not look away. The dinner proceeded. Speeches were given. Arthur stood and told a long story about the Ashford family legacy, about building something from nothing, about the importance of securing the future for your children. The room laughed in all the right places. Someone's wife near the front began to cry. Then the toast came. Arthur raised his glass to Declan and Elena. "To the next generation of the Ashford family," he said. "And to the legacy we're building together." Declan took the floor. He had the microphone in his hand and the room's attention. He looked at his father for a long moment, then turned to address the guests. "Before I respond," he said, in a voice that reached every corner of the room without needing to be raised, "there's something every person here has a right to see." The room blinked. Arthur's smile froze. And at the back of the room, a screen lowered from the ceiling. "I want to slow this down for you because it happened slowly." The room didn't understand all at once. First, there was confusion. Heads turning toward the back. People leaning toward each other, murmuring. Then there was recognition as Arthur Ashford's face appeared on the footage, and his voice came through the room's speakers. And then there was silence. Not the quiet kind. The kind where everyone in a room arrives at the same understanding at exactly the same moment. His voice filled the space. "The Ellis property is the last piece. Once we own that corner, the whole development goes through. The granddaughter has leverage. She wants to be part of this family. She'll do what she's told." Margaret's voice behind him. "And the mother? She seems like the sentimental type. Hanging on to that old building because of some family nonsense. Sentiment is just inertia with a sentimental name. Once the zoning passes, the offers will be too good to refuse. She'll sign." They all sign. I was watching faces rather than the screen. I already knew what was on it. I watched a woman in the third row press her hand to her mouth. I watched one of Arthur's longtime business partners rise slowly from his seat. I watched Margaret Ashford go the color of old paper. Arthur was on his feet. "Shut that thing off. That is edited. That is a fabrication." The recording kept going. The second clip was Arthur in his office, leaning over his desk, voice low and businesslike. "We've been acquiring parcels in Germantown for 18 months. The Ellis building is the final holdout. If the daughter signs before the zoning hits, we save $200,000 in eminent domain hearings. Get her to push the mother." A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp. Something heavier. Several people on the Ashford side stood up. Two walked toward the exit. The third recording was Margaret Ashford's voice, clear and unbothered. "Elena's mother is a good woman. A hard worker. But she doesn't understand how these things work. She's clinging to a building that's going to be demolished anyway. We'll be doing her a favor, really. She can use the money to buy something more sensible." The room broke open. I stayed completely still. I'd promised Declan I would stay still, and I held to that. Elena had her hand over her mouth, but she was still sitting upright. Calm. My daughter, who had spent a year and a half pretending to be okay in a room full of people who'd never really wanted her. Arthur charged toward the back of the room, toward the AV booth. The technician had already locked himself in. The presentation continued. Documents now. Purchase agreements. Buyer correspondence. Projected profit margins. Arthur's name on all of it. Dates of contact that preceded Declan's engagement by months. Then a woman stood. She was maybe 60, well-dressed but without any performance about it. She introduced herself as Helen Townsend. She was a lawyer. She'd been invited as a friend of the Ashford family. She said, "Mr. Ashford, what I have witnessed constitutes evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, document forgery, and theft by deception. I am advising you not to leave this building." I remember thinking, my mother would have loved this moment. Arthur blustered. Margaret wept. Declan's sister tried to move toward the exit and was gently, firmly stopped by one of Elena's friends, who simply stood in her path. She didn't fight it. She crumpled there in her gown on the ballroom floor and sobbed. And I know a person is supposed to feel something complicated about that. Maybe I did, somewhere deeper down. But what I felt in that immediate moment was the weight lifting. The weight of 3 generations and 15 years of missing Marcus and 18 months of swallowing something that tasted wrong. All of it releasing. If you have ever walked into a room where you felt like you didn't quite belong, where you'd done everything right and still felt the invisible judgment, you know exactly what that release feels like. That moment when the truth catches up to what you already knew in your gut but couldn't prove. That moment when the room stops looking through you and starts actually seeing. Police arrived within 40 minutes. All 3 Ashfords were escorted out. Arthur still arguing. Margaret behind dark glasses. Declan's sister with her hair askew. Some guests filmed on their phones. Others stood in stunned silence. One of Arthur's associates came to Declan crying, saying she was sorry, that she truly hadn't known. The caterers had gone. The string ensemble sat silent. Declan found me in the thinning crowd, and we stood side by side without talking for a while. Then he said, "The food's already paid for, Corinne." I looked around. Some guests had left, but Declan and Elena's real friends were still there. A handful of Arthur's own extended family had quietly chosen which side of the room to stand on. I saw Elena hugging her best friend, a girl she'd known since 2nd grade. I saw my brother, who'd driven down from Boston for the wedding, looking at me with something like pride. Declan said, "I'd rather celebrate than grieve." So we did. We ate. We put the music on. We danced. I danced with Elena, who held my face in her hands and said, "Daddy would be so proud of you, Mom." And I had to look away for a second because that landed somewhere deep and undeniable. Honestly, if that had been me 20 years younger, I don't know if I could have stayed in that room the way Declan did. I don't know if I could have held myself still through those recordings playing, watching the family I thought I was marrying in to reduce me and my daughter to a business calculation. That kind of sustained composure, the kind that doesn't flinch and doesn't perform, is its own kind of strength. I want you to sit with that. In the weeks that followed, Helen Townsend built the case methodically. Declan provided every recording and document. Forensic experts authenticated all of it. The investigation revealed what we hadn't fully known. The Ashford empire was in serious financial trouble. The mainline estate, the charity boards, the development company, all of it was a facade held together with debt and the kind of borrowed credibility that requires a continuous supply of new victims. Arthur had civil judgments in 2 other states. Margaret had maxed credit instruments across 4 accounts. They needed the Germantown development because they were desperate in a way they had spent years hiding. That gave me a complicated feeling. Not sympathy exactly, but an understanding of the difference between cruelty for its own sake and cruelty as a survival strategy adopted so young it became second nature. I thought about Arthur Ashford's father, the man who'd built the original business. I thought about how much of this was inherited. How much was learned. A woman named Patricia Vance contacted us 3 weeks after the cancelled wedding. She had been briefly engaged to an Ashford business associate 3 years earlier. The same playbook. Questions about her family's property. Pressure to share financial access. Threats when she disengaged. She testified at trial. 2 other people came forward with similar accounts. The settlement offer arrived before trial. $400,000 in exchange for dropping all charges. Declan and I sat with it for about 10 minutes. Then I said no. Not because I'm rich and didn't need the money. I am not rich and I could have used it. I said no because some things don't have a number attached. I said no because Patricia Vance deserved to tell her story in a courtroom. I said no because whoever came after us, and there would have been someone after us, deserves not to go through this. The trial was 3 weeks. The defense painted Declan as a vindictive son who had fabricated an elaborate revenge. It was a creative argument. It had nowhere to stand. You cannot argue manipulation in the face of your own voice on certified recordings. You cannot argue forgery when your own documents are examined by handwriting experts. You cannot argue pattern when 5 people from different cities and different years describe the identical sequence of events. Guilty on all counts. Arthur Ashford, 12 years. Margaret, 6. Declan's sister, 5. The judge said something in her final remarks that I've written on a piece of paper I keep above my workbench, the one that looks out over the carriage house. She said, the calculation this family made, that dignity is cheap, that integrity can be outmaneuvered, that a woman's worth is determined by her address, was the precise error that brought them here. Elena and Declan got married 6 months later at a small ceremony in my mother's garden. 20 people who genuinely knew us. My brother officiated. The flowers were the same ones I'd arranged for the engagement party, the ones Margaret had rejected. They'd sat in my cooler for 6 months, but I'd kept them anyway. We served food from a local deli and danced to a Spotify playlist. It was the best day I've had since Marcus died. Here's what this story taught me. And I mean this not as a platitude but as something I had to earn. The people who try hardest to diminish you are usually the most afraid of what you represent. Margaret Ashford didn't dismiss me because she believed I was a nobody. She did it because she needed to believe it. She needed me small so that what she was doing remained survivable to her. So she could keep telling herself it wasn't personal, wasn't wrong, was just business. The mistake most people make when they encounter that kind of dismissal is to turn it inward. To ask what they could have done differently to deserve more respect. The answer is nothing. There was nothing to fix. The problem was never yours. What Declan understood that nobody else in that room quite grasped until the screen came on was that the truth doesn't require permission. It doesn't need the right moment or the right venue or the right audience. It just needs someone willing to stand up and let it speak. And the question I want to leave you sitting with today, not as accusation, just as something to carry home, is this. Is there a room in your life where you've been making yourself smaller to make someone else comfortable? And if so, how long do you plan to keep doing that? I am 42 years old. I have calluses on my palms and a carriage house full of antiques and a daughter who calls me every single night. I wake before the sun and I work until my back tells me to stop. I sleep like a woman with nothing to hide. That is the whole inheritance I was ever after. That is all I ever wanted to leave behind.